Welcome to Buried Secrets, a podcast about the paranormal, the occult, and weird and forgotten history. I'm Chris. So this is the final episode, for now, of my series about the Old Alton Bridge, or Goatman's Bridge, which is located near Denton, Texas, right near where I grew up. Like I mentioned last time, there is a lot more that I can say about this famously haunted bridge. For example, when I was listening back to last week's episode to edit it, it struck me that Bob, someone who's claimed to have proliferated a lot of the legends of the bridge online, Bob seems to be linked to the Tulpa/egregore communities online, and the Goatman and the legends surrounding him definitely has some qualities that are reminiscent of some Tulpa stuff. I also have things to say about how BuzzFeed Unsolved, in particular, has created a whole nother layer of folklore and urban legends about the bridge. For example, in their episode about the bridge, they talk about how there's supposedly an entity named Steve near the bridge, which I hadn't seen mentioned before that, but which people now talk about pretty often online, especially in reviews and comment sections about this bridge. And that's really interesting to me, this idea that the legend is continuing to evolve. And now that it's evolving online, you can really trace that change a little bit more. So maybe I'll explore all of that another time, but I gotta talk about something else for a bit after this series. This series has been a little bit of a rough one, and I'm working on some maybe more positive or hopeful episodes for October once I'm back from my break, so that'll be a little bit of a palate cleanser at least, right? So in this episode, I want to share some of my final, for now, thoughts about the bridge, as well as talk a little bit more about debunkings of some of the bridge's legends and pranksters, because I've touched on those, but I saw a number of reviews and comments online from people who mentioned pranking each other or wanting to prank each other, so it felt worth talking about real quick. So for example, there are plenty of comments like, it's fun to visit at night, it's pretty easy to spook your friends. And one commenter mentioned wanting to go there and mess around with Bluetooth speakers, and I assume, make people think there's sounds out in the woods, etc. So just know that plenty of people are probably messing around and playing pranks on each other, and that's not to say that this bridge is not haunted, but just know that accounts of hauntings might be influenced a little bit by some potential pranks that people might be playing. Also, something that felt worth mentioning to me was that sometimes a haunted house called the Dark Path is staged in the woods near the Old Alton Bridge, around Halloween when these haunted houses tend to pop up. According to one listing that advertised the attraction in the Sanger News, quote, "The historic Old Alton Bridge and surrounding forest were the locations of horrific murders, suicides, disappearances, seances, ghost sightings, and paranormal investigations since 1938, which is really playing fast and loose with not even just the truth, but with, stories of urban legends. I guess, yeah, technically there have been plenty of stories of horrific murders there and in the area. I don't know that I've seen stories of suicides. The disappearances have been a little bit hard to confirm. The seances, okay, I guess technically there have been seances because people have been investigating the paranormal there. And if you're going there and trying to speak to the dead, that is a seance. Ghost sightings, okay, sure. And I love the idea that there have been paranormal investigations there since 1938. Because it kind of seems to me like legends about the bridge started bubbling up around the 70s and 80s. But it's ad copy for a haunted house. But the reason why that felt worth mentioning was that, these legends are being actively played upon, not just by pranksters, but also by things like this haunted house, which I'm not trying to criticize this haunted house or anything. This is just the way that this sort of attraction tends to talk about things. But it's another example of the legend kind of getting added to and twisted and, the fact that there's so much faking of the paranormal near there, potentially, for sure in the haunted house. And of course, that's not being passed off as a real haunting, right? Those are fun attractions. And then, also there might be a little bit of fakery and hoaxes with like teenagers playing pranks on each other. So that also adds to the legends of the bridge, the kind of like discourse about the bridge in the area and, in terms of people's experiences. And also, I am kind of curious about what effect kind of faking the paranormal might have in a haunted place. Like, I don't have information about that, but just like as a concept, I'm very interested in, what happens if you are pretending that something paranormal is going on in a place that actually is haunted or has something paranormal going on. Does that add to the stories? Does it stir things up? I don't know, but it's definitely something I'll be keeping an eye on and thinking about as I research additional haunted locations in the future. So then let's go on to just talk about some more nature-related debunkings of some of the Goatman's Bridge phenomena. Some of these I've mentioned before, but I wanted to just bring them up again all in one place. So, this bridge is in the woods, in like a suburban area, and there's hiking trails, and of course there's nature happening there. So there are stories about people seeing lights in the woods, kind of that will-o'-the-wisp sort of thing. And I did find reviews from folks mentioning fireflies in the area. Now, I don't know how common fireflies still are there. When I was growing up in the area in the 90s, I don't really remember seeing fireflies. And I remember actually when I moved to New York City, I was amazed because there are fireflies here, on summer nights, and that really stood out to me. So this person on Google Reviews says, I grew up just down the road a mile or two, loved nighttime ghost stories on the bridge and catching lightning bugs by the dozens. I still remember driving over that old bridge. Haven't seen the lightning bugs in the thousands like they used to be out there ever again. So sad. So I guess this person isn't saying like there are no fireflies in the area anymore, but it sounds like there's definitely fewer than there once were. But if someone is seeing lights in the woods, you can't rule out the possibility that they might be seeing fireflies, unless these lights are really not behaving like fireflies. I found one person who commented on a YouTube video about the bridge who claimed that the Goatman is just a goat. I have no idea. I don't know anything about goats. I have no idea if this is a possibility, but it felt like something that was worth sharing. So this person says, the Goatman is merely just a goat walking on its hind legs. You rarely see it happen, but goats can do it. In fact, there was a Facebook video just going around in March 2022 of the very thing. A goat walking on its hind legs, standing upright and looking spooky. So that's a possible explanation for folks who claim that they have seen a goat man, though there's definitely fewer claims of that than there are of people, having more vibes-based experiences about like being touched or hearing strange things, etc. I found someone on Reddit who had some interesting things to say about their investigation there. Some friends and I went about 10 to 15 years ago armed with a video camera, an EMF detector, and a voice recorder and did a paranormal investigation and found weird noises, cats, water splashing under the bridge, turtles, and the red eyes in the distance are all car tail lights from a road several miles away. We did not find anything paranormal, although we wanted to. So, one person's experience, I think those debunkings sound totally valid for, the phenomena they were experiencing. Another commenter on YouTube said, this is Texas, so no doubts of coyotes. There's a farm near the bridge, and it's also used as a horse trail. So, like a million animals before a demon, lol. Which I think is a fair thing to say. Another commenter on YouTube says, and this is on a video where some people were filming on the bridge and like heard a woman screaming. This person says, interesting thing about the screaming they keep hearing is that cougars/mountain lions sound horrifically like a woman screaming. So there was probably a cougar stalking around in the area. Someone else in the comments of a YouTube video says, listen, I was rewatching this and I'm looking at the video and I love how you can actually see eyes when they're asking about who's there. And if you look to the right of the screen, you can see two yellow eyes there, which is cool because it's most likely the fox who's screaming. As the scream is deaf, a fox screaming. Someone else says, I live nearby this. Between fireflies, bedding deer making creepy noises, and car headlights from the highway, people get creeped out. I thought this next comment was pretty interesting, like a kind of interesting interpretation and twist on some of this. So this person says, I was showing some episodes to my brother, and when we saw the part where the bush moved and there was something that sounded like a scream, he paused it and showed me a video of a mountain lion trying to roar. Fun fact, it sounds uncannily like a woman screaming bloody murder. So while there might not have been a demon encounter, you guys were likely very close to death. The presence of the camera crew and use of the very loud spirit box likely kept you safe. I just found that really interesting, this kind of idea of like how potentially someone might be in the woods looking for ghosts, dangerous demons and ghosts, when actually they're making so much noise that they're like keeping themselves safe from local wildlife. Another person said that a scream that a video had was either a bobcat or a mountain lion. And then this comment just made me laugh. Did anyone see the Ghost Adventures episode on Goatman's? They acted like it was super haunted. Meanwhile, I walked it at night and the worst thing that happened was all the damn spiders. So that's what I have for debunkings. Now, again, I do believe that there is something paranormal afoot at Goatman's Bridge. But I also very much believe that it's very possible that things people have experienced could be attributed to wildlife. Not all of it, of course, but some of it. Especially stuff like the screams and if there's eye shine and like that sort of thing. So just worth keeping in mind in general. So with that, I want to talk just a little bit more about the hauntings in general and kind of things I've been thinking about while doing this series. So here's a time when you can catch me in an inconsistency if you're a longtime listener. So I know in the past I've complained about how it seems like, at least in the ghost stories of New York City, where I live, so many of the stories that are attributed to a certain person are usually supposedly white historical figures, often enslavers. And I've talked a little bit about my discomfort with the idea of people being written out of both written history and urban legends. Like in New York City, it just has always been confusing to me that so many hauntings are about super famous, kind of evil historical figures, but like the ordinary people of New York City don't really seem to get the same sort of memorializing in ghost stories. Now, I haven't done as much paranormal research about locations in the South and in the West and other parts of the world. So maybe this is a New York City phenomenon, this idea that like most named ghosts are like famous people from your history books, just because like so many people have passed in New York City, like both passed through the city and also died here, lived here, etc. So while I have always been bothered by that aspect of New York City legends, now that I've been kind of going through all of these urban legends and stories about a Black man who was murdered, as the legend goes, I've been thinking a lot about claims that I've made where I'm like, I don't think it's good that urban legends tend to just be about like enslavers and the rich and powerful, etc. And when it comes to the stories of Goatman's Bridge, I'm really of two minds. I feel weird about this story. It's this horrifying tale of a lynching, potentially two lynchings, that has been transformed into a creepy campfire-style urban legend for legend trippers and drunk teenagers to tell each other and talk about online and generally, just treat it like something that's not totally real. Since, as I have talked about extensively in this series, white supremacy is and was a major problem, both in the South and, really everywhere in the US. But on the other hand, this urban legend seems to have sort of unearthed this story of racism and white supremacy in the area that white supremacists had sought to bury. I talked about Quakertown and I talked about the horrific murders that were quietly carried out by the KKK in the area. And, a lot of that research was done in the last few years by students at the University of North Texas, for master's theses, which I've, of course, read from extensively. And there's this part of me that wonders how much of that would have gotten unearthed if there wasn't this legend about a lynching that's so prominent in an area that for so long everyone was like, oh, there weren't racial lynchings here. That just wasn't a thing in Denton, was never a thing, etc. So this urban legend is doing a lot of different things. And I guess, nothing is all good or bad. But, there's always this part of me, especially when wrapping up a series, that wants to be able to put something in a box or say, like, this is really great or this is really terrible, etc. And I mean, this is a very complex story and a really screwed up story and an area with a real bad history. And I know I've talked about this in the past, including in the episode that I did about the supposed curse of the Fordham Ram, for example. But one question I'm interested in is, do people use tales of urban legends and hauntings to obfuscate horrific things that they feel uncomfortable with or maybe even feel guilty about? Or is it a way that things bubble up even when people don't want them to bubble up? Like it's in the, zeitgeist or collective unconscious or whatever, and like that history just like can't be suppressed as much as the powers that be might want to. At any rate, it seems like there's something psychological at work there, but I'm almost more interested in what that does to people's conception of history and the past. In the United States, the version of history taught by the education system can often be a bit lacking and selective. And at least in my experience, having gone to public schools in Texas, the education system and curriculum tends to downplay some of the truly horrific parts of the United States history, like the slave trade and just chattel slavery in general in the US. Of course, you learn about it in schools, but not to the extent that I think it probably should be taught. And of course, we learn about Reconstruction in school, but again, it feels a little bit incomplete. And then, of course, there's white supremacy and the rise of the KKK, etc. And I know that Texas is a little bit notorious for having its own textbooks written. Like, I remember growing up, you would open a textbook and it would have, like, on the title page or whatever, it would say, like, this is the Texas version of a textbook. So I do think living in this world where history is being rewritten, and, like, that happens in any society, right? Like, history is written by the victor or whatever. But I do think this sort of urban legend could be instructive for teenagers who are not necessarily learning this stuff in school. I'm not saying that that's actually what this urban legend is doing, but my hope would be that maybe it could help educate people a little bit more about the history of the area where they live, right? But then there's this other part of me that's like, well, there are these stories about these terrible parts of history, but they're transmuting it into a creepy story, a legend that you don't need to engage with if you don't want to. And because it's a ghost story or an urban legend, it's easy to say, oh, it's a made-up story, ghosts aren't real, the stuff in the story isn't real. So a story like the Old Alton Bridge's Goatman could potentially lump this legacy of racial violence into the same zone of unreality that urban legends and ghosts and Goatman-type cryptids, etc. inhabit. So I kind of feel like it can go either way. I wanted to read some from things that smart people from the area have written about this that might be more coherent than some of my thoughts. So first I wanted to read a little bit from Micah Carlson Crittenden's May 2020 master's thesis from the University of North Texas. I've read from this a lot, but it's called In the Tall Grass West of Town, Racial Violence in Denton County During the Rise of the Second Ku Klux Klan. So, to read from this, for a tale to catch steam, it must resonate with reality even as it injects a mystical component into everyday life. Through the story of the Goatman, it can be surmised that Denton County residents believed that the local Ku Klux Klan was not only in existence, but capable of the brutal murder of the Washburn family in 1938. They also believed that the existence of a moderately successful black farmer was enough to enrage hooded white citizens into the commission of heinous acts of violence. These acts would only be possible through the dehumanization of Black families, even those well known to the membership of the KKK. To skip a bit later in the paper, there is a complex code of silence surrounding racial violence in Denton County. Privately, the Black community was all too aware of the crimes committed against itself, and yet a public silence was required by the white supremacist power structure. The same dichotomy is observable in the white population. The perpetrators of racial violence were members of the white community and therefore knew of the crimes as they were committed. However, like the masked costume of the Ku Klux Klan, white knowledge of these crimes was capped. It does not appear to this researcher that anyone discussed racial violence in Denton County in a public forum during the 1920s. The divide between private and public acknowledgement has led to a modern ignorance of local racial terrorism. Yet, despite the best efforts of white supremacist sympathizers at containment, the truth leaks out through folklore. Stories like that of the Goatman signal to a violent past without direct indictment of the participants. I think that was a really insightful and cutting summary of kind of like a lot of stuff at work in this story. So next, I wanted to read a bit from an article that was published in the blog We Didn't Do It, written by Sean Treat, who founded the Denton Haunts Historical Ghost Tour and who I've talked about in prior episodes, and I think I've quoted a bit from interviews with him that I found. But he had a nice summary of some of the conclusions that could be drawn from the Old Alton Bridge stories. You won't find the names of Oscar Washburn or Jack Kendall in any historical records. Most ghosts are given names because we need to feel like we can know them. As a mentor once wisely advised, never let the facts of the story obscure the truths in the tale. If history is the self-congratulatory narrative of a community written by its victorious elite, then our ghosts will often problematize and haunt such tidy romanticisms of back in the day. A handful of states have a Goatman tale, with Texas having a few itself, but each expresses unique reminders of threats from a forgotten past. Liminal areas of crossing can be full of possibility and danger. Present injustices are informed by past prejudices, and there are critters, like snakes or gators, down in the creek that young'uns might oughta be leery of. The Goatman isn't just a haunting campfire tale, it's also a reminder that an ignorance of our history is no protection from its everlasting consequences. All right, and I think this is the last passage from a person who's smarter than me that I wanted to read for this. But there was this great write-up from last year on steampunklibrarian.blog. This is from October 2021. And I wanted to read a bit from this. So the author of this post, Elizabeth Hedrick, had lived in Denton for 12 years as of when she wrote this blog post. And she was a student at Texas Women's University for 7 years. And as a reminder, TWU was once known as the Texas Industrial Institute and College for the Education of White Girls of the State of Texas in the Arts and Sciences, which was part of the excuse for destroying the Black community of Quakertown in Denton. So again, the past is never that far away. This is probably the best analysis I've found on the subject, or at least one of my favorite pieces of writing about it, and it really eloquently puts into words some of the stuff I've been trying, perhaps less eloquently, to articulate. So I just wanted to read from that. The simple fact of the matter is that while Washburn may or may not have existed, racial injustice, up to and including lynching, did exist in Denton County for a very long time. And we all know this, even if many of Denton's white residents choose to ignore and deny these very facts. But certain facts can't be ignored or denied, like the fact that things were so bad in Texas that it was named the #1 state for lynchings in 1922. And the Klan was very much a presence here in Denton, with over 300 hooded figures showing up in the streets of this town a few days before Christmas 1921 for a torchlit parade. The real horror of the Goatman lies in the fact that he stands as a cutout for the racial violence that Denton County has exacted on its Black residents. The actual person of Oscar Washburn may not have existed, but so many more men like him did exist. They struggled to create lives in a community that didn't welcome them, and they were killed for base and meaningless reasons. By taking this Black man, who was said to have been murdered in this way, and by giving him the demonic visage of a goat, he is dehumanized, the fact of his race removed, so that he can be considered scary, something for ghost hunters to search for so that they can get a good story. all while giving only the vaguest pass to the acts of violence that precipitated his demonic nature. The terror of his death matters less than the terror that he causes in his afterlife, and that should tell us something about the ghost stories we create. So anyway, I thought that was very well put. And speaking of creating stories, I do want to return to the book The Vanishing Hitchhiker by Jan Harold Brunvand, which I know I've talked about plenty in this series and also in other episodes. But it's a really great book about urban legends in America and kind of like what folklore does and what urban legends do, etc. Very worth reading. I recommend getting it. I coincidentally picked it up last December when I was in the area. I got it at Half Price Books. So I went to the Goatman's Bridge and maybe like a couple days later went to Half Price Books, and this book happened to be sitting there on like the metaphysical shelf or whatever, like a very old out of print version of it. And then I read it right after visiting the Goatman's Bridge. So I think that's probably one reason why this book has been very in my mind throughout this series, but just in general, it's a smart book about folklore. So I wanted to read a bit from that. In order to be retained in a culture, any form of folklore must fill some genuine need, whether this be the need for an entertaining escape from reality or a desire to validate by anecdotal examples some of the culture's ideals and institutions. For legends in general, a major function has always been an attempt to explain unusual or supernatural happenings in the natural world. Urban legends gratify our desire to know about and try to understand bizarre, frightening, and potentially dangerous or embarrassing events that may have happened. Informal stories and rumors fill in the gaps left by professional news reporting. And these marvelous, though generally false, true tales may be said to be carrying the folk news, along with some editorial matter, from person to person, even in today's highly technological world. So that last part, to me, really resonates the most. This idea of carrying on folk news, or stories that may have been repressed or left out by traditional sources. And to me, that's the biggest function, I guess, that the Legends of the Goatman and Old Alton Bridge serves. It's transmitting folk news. And with the internet, it's been transmitting it quite quickly. And I guess, for me personally, as someone from the area, that is how the legends have functions. I became interested in this paranormal tale only to learn about a horrific history about the area I grew up in. And that history, the legacy of slavery, the Texas Troubles of 1860, the many lynchings, were all things that had somehow been left out of my education or greatly downplayed. And again, plenty of people online love to point out that Oscar Washburn and Jack Kendall don't seem to be real historical people, at least according to the records that are currently accessible and that, weren't destroyed. I did talk a little bit about record loss in a past episode in this series, but a lot of people online love to point out the fact that they aren't real people. But, personally, the stories of their horrific murders led me to learn about other horrific murders in the area that were very real and definitely confirmed by the historical record. And I do think that the Old Alton Bridge and the stories of the Goatman are sort of at their best when they are acting as a transmitter of folk news and kind of subverting this overarching narrative that was written by, I don't want to say written by white supremacists, but I think I mean written by white supremacists, right? Like I talked in the past about how a lot of the wealthy and influential people in the area back in the day were affiliated with the KKK or at least ideals of white supremacy. So I think that these legends are at their best when they are working as a form of folk news and educating people about a forgotten part of the past. And they are perhaps at their worst when they are sensationalized stories that allow people to paint this legacy of racism and racial murders with the same brush that urban legends and ghost stories, etc. get painted with. Because, of course, I think that the paranormal is real. And while I don't believe most urban legends necessarily, I do allow for the idea that they might be indicating places that have like paranormal significance. and activity. But, most people see the paranormal as like an entertaining diversion or complete nonsense. And it's not good for this underrepresented part of American history, Texas history, etc., to get dismissed in the same way that the paranormal might be. So anyway, that's what I have to say about the Old Alton Bridge, at least for now. If you're listening to this and you're from the area and you've experienced anything related to the bridge and its stories, or you have thoughts, etc., please let me know. If I get additional stories, etc., I might do a follow-up episode or a couple follow-up episodes in the future because, I still have plenty of things in my notes about this bridge that I did not get to and will not get to this time around. But thank you for going on this, 9-episode journey into the lore of this haunted bridge near my hometown. And like I mentioned last time, I am going to take September off. I'll be doing a lot of travel in September and won't be able to be recording episodes and stuff, but I'll be back in October with some new stories. So, as always, the show notes and sources for this episode and this series can be found at buriedsecretspodcast.com. If you liked this episode, please rate and review it. Wherever you listen to podcasts, please tell your friends about it. That really helps get the word out about the podcast. If you want to contact me, you can email me at buriedsecretspodcast@gmail.com. And thanks so much for listening.